The dust storm came without warning, turning the afternoon sky black as midnight, and Grace Merrick was already certain she would die out here when the stranger's hand caught her horse's bridle and pulled her toward shelter. She could not see his face through the swirling sand that bit at her exposed skin like 1,000 angry wasps. The wind howled with such ferocity that even screaming would have been useless. Grace felt her mare stumble, felt the animal's terror matching her own, and then suddenly they were moving in a different direction. The stranger's grip was firm, his movements confident despite the chaos that surrounded them. Within moments that felt like hours, they ducked into what seemed to be a rocky outcropping, and the violence of the storm became merely a roar instead of a physical assault. Grace slid from her saddle, her legs barely holding her weight. She pressed her back against the stone wall, gasping for breath, tasting grit between her teeth. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she could finally make out the man who had saved her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat and dust. He was tending to both horses, speaking to them in low, calming tones that somehow carried over the storm's fury. "Thank you," Grace managed to say, though her throat felt raw. "I did not see it coming." The stranger glanced at her, and even in the poor light she could see his eyes were a striking blue-gray, like storm clouds themselves. "Nobody ever does in these parts," he said. His voice was deep, steady. "Spring storms in Nevada come up fast. You are lucky I was riding this way." Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. She was 42 years old, widowed for 5 years, and had thought herself past the point of needing rescue. She had been riding back to Piotch from a neighboring ranch, where she had been helping with a difficult birth, one of the few services she still provided to the community. Midwifery had been her trade for 20 years, and she was good at it, but lately she felt the weight of all those years pressing down on her shoulders like stones. "I am Grace Merrick," she said, because manners dictated introduction even in dire circumstances. "Yates Quinn," the man replied. He finished securing the horses and moved to sit against the opposite wall, giving her space. "I work cattle for the Morrison Ranch, about 10 miles south of Piotch." The storm continued to rage outside their shelter. Sand occasionally whipped in through the opening, but they were protected from the worst of it. Grace studied Yates Quinn in the intermittent light. He looked to be in his early 30s, with weathered skin that spoke of years under the harsh Nevada sun. There was a quiet competence about him, a stillness that she found oddly comforting. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked. "Could be an hour, could be 3, Yates said. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. "Drink, you will need it." Grace accepted the canteen gratefully. The water was warm but clean, and she drank deeply before handing it back. "I should have been more careful. I have lived in Piotch for 18 years. I know better than to ride out without checking the sky." "Everyone makes mistakes," Yates said simply. He took a drink himself, then set the canteen between them. "What takes you out riding alone?" "I am a midwife," Grace explained. "Sarah Jenkins was having her 4th child and her husband was worried. Everything went fine, but I stayed longer than I should have to make sure both mother and baby were well." Yates nodded. "That is good work." "It is the only work I have left," Grace said, and was surprised at the bitterness in her own voice. She had not meant to sound so harsh. Yates looked at her with those steady eyes. "You sound like someone who has lost more than most." Grace laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Is it that obvious? My husband died 5 years ago. Pneumonia took him in the space of a week. We had a small ranch, but I could not manage it alone. I sold most of the land, kept the house in town. My sons moved to California, chasing gold that probably does not exist. They write occasionally, but I have not seen them in 3 years. I help bring children into this world, but I have no children of my own nearby to hold." She stopped abruptly, embarrassed by her own confession. She did not know this man, had no reason to pour out her heart to him, but something about the storm, about being trapped in this small space with a stranger, had loosened her tongue. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "You did not save my life just to hear me complain about it." "I do not mind listening," Yates said quietly. "Everyone needs someone to listen sometimes." They sat in silence for a while, the storm providing a strange kind of privacy. Grace found herself studying Yates more carefully. He had strong hands, scarred from years of ranch work. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots well maintained. There was a sadness in his eyes that matched her own, she realized, though he hid it better. "What about you?" she asked finally. "What brings a cattleman to ride through a dust storm?" "Was checking on strays," Yates said. "Morrison lost about a dozen head last week. We think they wandered into the hills. I was tracking them when the storm hit." He paused, then added, "I am not much for talking about myself." "That makes two of us," Grace said. "Yet here I am, having told you my whole sad story." "It is not sad," Yates said. "It is life. Life is hard out here, but you are still here, still helping people. That counts for something." "Does it?" Grace asked. The question came out more plaintive than she intended. "I am 42 years old, Mr. Quinn. I am too old for hope, too old to dream of anything changing. I wake up, I do my work, I go to sleep, and tomorrow will be exactly the same." Yates was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was firm. "Then I will wait until you believe again." Grace stared at him. "What, in hope?" Yates said. He met her eyes directly. "If you are too old for it now, I will wait until you believe again. Because everyone deserves hope, Mrs. Merrick, no matter their age." Something in Grace's chest tightened. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her with such conviction, such simple faith. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Yates said. "I know you ride out alone to help people. I know you have survived loss and kept going. I know you are sitting here in a dust storm instead of falling apart." He leaned forward slightly. "That tells me you are stronger than you think, and strength like that deserves hope." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, which mortified her. She was not a woman who cried, had not cried even at her husband's funeral. She turned her face away, blinking rapidly. "You are very kind, Mr. Quinn." "Yates," he corrected gently. "And I am not being kind, I am being honest." The storm began to lessen outside. The howling wind dropped to a steady moan, and the visibility improved slightly. Yates stood and checked the opening. "I think the worst has passed. We should be able to ride soon, once the air clears a bit more." Grace stood as well, brushing dust from her riding skirt. She felt disheveled, grimy, and emotionally raw. "How far are we from Piach?" "About 5 miles, I would guess," Yates said. He turned back to her. "I will ride with you, make sure you get home safely." "That is not necessary," Grace started to protest, but Yates shook his head. "It is necessary," he said firmly. "The storm may have passed, but the ground will be unstable. Visibility is still poor. And after what you said earlier, I am not leaving you to ride alone." Grace wanted to argue, but the truth was she felt shaken, both by the storm and by their conversation. "Very well," she conceded. "Thank you." They waited another 20 minutes for the air to clear further, then led their horses out of the shelter. The landscape had transformed. What had been dusty but navigable terrain was now a sea of loose sand and debris. The sky was lighter, but everything was covered in a fine coating of reddish-brown dust. They mounted up and began riding toward Piach. Yates led the way, his horse picking carefully through the altered landscape. Grace followed, grateful for his presence even though she would not have admitted it aloud. Her mare was skittish, nervous from the ordeal, and Grace had to concentrate on keeping her calm. "There," Yates said after about 40 minutes of riding. He pointed ahead, and Grace could see the buildings of Piach emerging through the haze. Piach was a mining town, born from the silver strikes of the late 1860s. In the spring of 1887, it was still a bustling community, though some of the initial frenzy had died down. The main street was lined with businesses: a general store, saloons, a hotel, the assay office. Grace's house was on the eastern edge of town, a small wooden structure with a front porch and a well in the yard. As they rode into town, several people called out to Grace, clearly relieved to see her. News of the dust storm had reached Piach before they had, and people had been worried. "Grace, thank the Lord you are safe," Mrs. Peterson called from her doorway. "We were so worried," added Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith. His eyes moved to Yates with curiosity. "Who is your friend?" "This is Yates Quinn," Grace said. "He found me in the storm and led me to shelter. I would likely be dead without his help." Tom came forward to shake Yates's hand. "Then you have the thanks of this whole town, Mr. Quinn. Grace is one of our finest citizens. We would be lost without her." Yates accepted the thanks with quiet grace, but Grace could see he was uncomfortable with the attention. They continued through town to her house, and when they arrived, Grace dismounted with relief. Her legs were shaky, and she had to hold onto her saddle for a moment to steady herself. Yates was beside her instantly. "Are you all right?" "Just tired," Grace assured him. She looked up at him, this stranger who had saved her life and said such unexpected things. "Will you come in for coffee? It is the least I can offer after what you have done." Yates hesitated, then nodded. Coffee would be good. He helped her unsaddle her mare and get both horses settled with water. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she pumped water from the well, and she was grateful when Yates took over the task. Inside her house, everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that had seeped through the cracks, but Grace had lived through enough storms to expect it. She lit the stove and put coffee on to boil while Yates stood awkwardly in her small kitchen. "You can sit," she told him, gesturing to the table. "Thank you." He sat, removing his hat and setting it on the table. His hair was dark brown, she saw now, with threads of gray at the temples. Grace moved around her kitchen with practiced efficiency, getting cups, checking the coffee. She felt strange having a man in her house. Since her husband's death, she had lived alone, and she had grown accustomed to the solitude. But Yates's presence was not intrusive. He simply sat, patient and quiet, until she brought 2 cups of steaming coffee to the table and sat across from him. "Thank you again," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, "for everything." Yates took a sip of his coffee, then looked at her directly. "What I said earlier in the shelter, I meant it." Grace felt her heart skip. About waiting," Yates confirmed. "You said you are too old for hope. I say you are not, and I will prove it to you if you will let me." "How?" Grace asked. The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "By courting you," Yates said simply, "if you will allow it." Grace set down her cup with a trembling hand. "Mr. Quinn," Yates, "you cannot be serious. You just met me. You do not know anything about me." "I know you are kind," Yates said. "I know you are dedicated to helping others. I know you have strength and courage. I know you deserve better than to think your life is over at 42. He paused. "And I know that from the moment I saw you in that shelter, something in me recognized something in you." "You are talking about love," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Love at first sight. That is a children's story, not reality." "Maybe," Yates said. "Or maybe it is the beginning of something that could become love, if we give it a chance." He reached across the table, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand near hers. "I am 34 years old, Mrs. Merrick. I have worked ranches from Texas to Nevada. I have seen hard times and good times. I have loved before and lost. I thought I was content to live alone, to work my days and sleep my nights and nothing more. But then I met you and something changed." Grace stared at him, her mind spinning. "This is insane." "Probably," Yates agreed with a small smile, "but the best things often are." Grace stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the town was cleaning up from the storm, people sweeping dust from their porches and storefronts. "I cannot do this," she said quietly. "I cannot let myself hope again. It hurt too much when I lost my husband. It hurts every day that my sons do not write. I have built walls around my heart, Yates, and I do not know if I can tear them down." She heard him stand, felt him move to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but his presence was solid, comforting. "I am not asking you to tear down anything," he said quietly. "I am just asking you to let me stand outside those walls for a while. Let me show you that hope is not something to be feared. Let me court you properly, with respect and patience. And if, after some time, you still feel nothing, I will walk away. But give it a chance, Grace. Give us a chance." Grace closed her eyes. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was foolish, that she barely knew this man, that she should send him away and return to her safe, predictable life. But another part of her, a part she thought had died years ago, was stirring to life. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something beautiful. "I do not know," she whispered. "Think about it," Yates said. "I am staying at the boarding house on Main Street for the next few days. Morrison does not need me back at the ranch until Monday. If you decide you want to see me again, I will be here. If not, I will understand." He stepped back, and Grace heard him pick up his hat. She turned to face him. "Why?" she asked. "Why me? There are younger women in this town, women without all my baggage and pain." Yates met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because when I looked at you in that shelter, I did not see age or pain. I saw a woman who had survived and endured. I saw someone who had been knocked down by life but had gotten back up. I saw strength and beauty and something I cannot quite name but recognize anyway." He moved toward the door. "And because I meant what I said, I will wait until you believe again." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Grace stood frozen in her kitchen, her coffee growing cold on the table, and wondered if the dust storm had addled her brains. But as she sank back into her chair, she could not deny the small flame of something warm and unfamiliar flickering in her chest. It felt dangerously close to hope. The next morning, Grace woke to find her world had shifted slightly. She went through her morning routine, making breakfast, tidying her house, but her mind kept returning to Yates Quinn and his impossible proposal. Court her, at her age. The very idea seemed absurd in the clear light of day. Yet as she walked to the general store to pick up supplies, she found herself scanning the street for a tall figure with dark hair and blue-gray eyes. She did not see him, and the disappointment she felt was sharper than she expected. Martha Wilson, who ran the general store with her husband, greeted Grace with a knowing smile. "I heard about your adventure yesterday," she said, "and about the handsome cattleman who rescued you." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "News travels fast. Always does," Martha said cheerfully. She was a plump woman in her 50s with a kind face and an unfortunate tendency toward gossip. "Tom Fletcher said he seemed quite taken with you." "Martha, please," Grace said, focusing on her shopping list. "He was simply being kind." "Hum," Martha said, clearly unconvinced. "Well, he was in here earlier this morning buying supplies. Asked about you, actually. Wanted to know how long you had lived in Piotch, whether you were well regarded in the community." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "I told him you were one of the finest women in town, a true lady." Grace did not know whether to be mortified or touched. You should not have done that. Why not? It is the truth. Martha began gathering the items on Grace's list. You have been alone too long, Grace. Ever since Robert died, you have shut yourself away. Maybe this man is exactly what you need. Or maybe he is a complication I do not need, Grace countered. But her protest sounded weak even to her own ears. She finished her shopping and walked back home, her mind churning. Part of her wanted to march to the boarding house and tell Yates that she had thought it over and the answer was no. But another part of her, the part that had lain dormant for so long, wanted to run to him and say yes to everything he had offered. That afternoon, as Grace was tending to her small garden behind her house, she heard footsteps on the side path. She looked up to find Yates approaching, his hat in his hands. "I hope I am not intruding," he said. Grace stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "No, I was just weeding." They stood looking at each other for a moment, and Grace was struck again by how solid he seemed, how present. Most people in her life felt like shadows now, going through motions. But Yates was vivid, real in a way that made everything around him seem sharper. "I have been thinking about what you said," Grace began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "And?" Yates prompted gently. "And I do not know what to say," Grace admitted. "This is all so sudden. I do not know you, you do not know me. How can you possibly want to court someone you just met?" Yates stepped closer, though he maintained a respectful distance. "You are right that we do not know each other well. That is what courting is for, to learn about each other, to see if what I felt yesterday was real or just a moment of storm-induced madness." He smiled slightly. "But I do not think it was madness, Grace. I think it was recognition." "Recognition of what?" "Of someone who understands," Yates said. "I have not been entirely honest with you. I said I have loved and lost before. What I did not say is that my wife died 7 years ago in childbirth, along with our daughter. I was 27 years old, and in one night I lost everything that mattered to me." Grace felt her heart clench. "Oh, Yates, I am so sorry." "I tell you this not for sympathy but to explain," Yates continued. "For 7 years I have drifted from ranch to ranch, working hard, keeping to myself. I told myself I was content, that I did not need anything more than the work and the sky and the land. But I was lying. I was just too afraid to hope for anything better." He met her eyes. "Yesterday, when I saw you, when I talked to you, something woke up inside me. I realized I have been sleepwalking through my life, just like you have been." Grace wrapped her arms around herself. "So we are two broken people who happen to meet in a storm. Or we are two people who have survived and who might, possibly, help each other live again," Yates countered. "I am not asking for promises, Grace. I am just asking for a chance. Let me come calling. Let us have dinner together, take walks, talk. Let us see if this feeling between us is real." Grace looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the hope he was offering her like a gift, and she realized that she had a choice. She could send him away and return to her safe, lonely life. Or she could take a risk, could step out of her comfortable numbness and feel something again. It terrified her. It also thrilled her. "All right," she heard herself say. "You may call on me, but I am not promising anything beyond that." The smile that spread across Yates's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "That is all I am asking." And so began the strangest, most wonderful period of Grace's life in recent memory. Yates called on her that very evening, bringing wildflowers he had picked from the hills outside town. They sat on her front porch and talked as the sun set, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple. Yates told her about his childhood in Missouri, about how his father had been a farmer who lost everything in the panic of 1873. He told her about heading west as a teenager, learning the cattle trade in Texas, and eventually making his way to Nevada. He spoke of his late wife, Clara, with a tenderness that made Grace's heart ache. She was kind, he said quietly, and brave. When she went into labor, she knew something was wrong, but she kept telling me everything would be fine, even as she grew weaker. The midwife did everything she could, but Clara lost too much blood. The baby, our daughter Lily, only lived for an hour. Grace reached out without thinking and took his hand. I have delivered hundreds of babies, she said softly, and I have seen women die. It is the hardest part of what I do, knowing that sometimes all my skill and experience are not enough. I am sorry you had to endure that. Yates squeezed her hand. It broke me for a while. I was angry at God, at the world, at myself. But time passes and eventually the sharp edges of grief become smooth. You learn to carry it without it cutting you every moment. Yes, Grace agreed. That is exactly right. She told him about Robert, her husband of 17 years. How they had come to Piotch full of dreams and optimism, planning to make their fortune in ranching. How they had built a life together, raised 2 strong sons, and survived the harsh realities of Nevada living. And how quickly it had all fallen apart when Robert caught pneumonia. He was fine one day, sick the next, and gone within a week, she said. I kept waiting for him to get better. I am a midwife. I understand medicine and healing, but there was nothing I could do. He just slipped away. She paused. My sons blamed me, I think. They never said it outright, but I could see it in their eyes. If their mother understood healing, why could she not save their father? They left for California within 6 months. That is not fair to you, Yates said firmly. You are not God. You cannot control life and death. I know that in my head, Grace said, but my heart took longer to accept it. They talked until the stars came out, until the temperature dropped and Grace began to shiver. Yates immediately stood. I should let you go inside. It is getting cold. Will I see you tomorrow? Grace asked, then felt foolish for sounding so eager. Yates's smile was warm. If you would like, I could take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. Yes, Grace said. I would like that. After Yates left, Grace went inside and lay in her bed staring at the ceiling. She felt strange, unsettled in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. For so long her emotions had been flat, muted. But now, talking with Yates, she had felt genuine interest, genuine connection. It scared her, but it also made her feel more alive than she had in years. The next day, Grace spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear to dinner. She had not cared about her appearance in years beyond basic neatness and propriety. But now she found herself examining her reflection critically, wishing her hair was not quite so streaked with gray, that the lines around her eyes were not quite so deep. Finally, she settled on a dark blue dress that brought out her eyes. It was one of her nicer garments, saved for church and special occasions. She put her hair up in a simple but neat style and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them. When Yates arrived to collect her, the look in his eyes made all her fussing worthwhile. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you, Grace replied, feeling absurdly pleased. They walked together to the hotel, and Grace was acutely aware of the curious looks they received. Piotch was a small enough town that everyone knew everyone else's business, and a single woman dining with a man would definitely be noticed. But for once, Grace did not care about the gossip. The hotel restaurant was modest but clean, with white tablecloths and decent food. Yates held her chair for her, a courtesy that made Grace feel like a young girl again. They ordered roast chicken and vegetables, and as they ate, Yates told her more about his work. I have been thinking about settling down, he said. I have saved most of my pay over the years. I could buy a small piece of land, run a few head of cattle, nothing large but enough to be my own boss. Where would you want to settle? Grace asked. Yates met her eyes. That depends. On what? On whether you decide you want me around, he said quietly. I told Morrison I might be leaving his employ, he understands. But I will not buy land in Piotch if you send me away at the end of this courtship. Grace felt her breath catch. You would uproot your life based on what I decide. I would, Yates said, because what I feel for you is worth the risk. Grace set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. How can you be so sure? We have known each other for 2 days. Sometimes that is all it takes, Yates said. He reached across the table and took her hand. I am not a young man prone to foolish infatuation, Grace. I am old enough to know my own heart. And my heart is telling me that you are worth fighting for. Grace felt tears threaten again. I do not know if I can be what you need. You already are, Yates said. You are honest and strong and real. That is all I need. They finished their dinner in comfortable silence, and then Yates walked her home. At her door, he paused. May I call on you again tomorrow? Yes, Grace said. Then, on impulse, she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. Good night, Yates. She slipped inside before she could see his reaction, her heart pounding. She felt like a schoolgirl, giddy and nervous and foolish. But she also felt happy, genuinely happy for the first time in years. Over the next week, Yates called on Grace every day. They took walks through Piotch and into the surrounding hills. They shared meals and stories. Yates told her about the different ranches he had worked, the cattle drives he had been on, the beauty and brutality of life in the West. Grace told him about the babies she had delivered, the families she had helped, the joys and sorrows of her work. One afternoon, they rode out to the site of Grace's old ranch. It was about 8 miles from Piotch, nestled in a small valley with a creek running through it. The current owners, a young couple from California, were doing their best with the land, but Grace could see it was hard for them. Robert and I built that barn ourselves, Grace said, pointing to a weathered structure. It took us an entire summer. My hands were covered in blisters, but I was so proud when it was finished. Yates looked around the property. It is good land. You must have been sad to leave it. I was, Grace admitted, but I could not manage it alone. I did not have the strength or the help. She paused. My sons offered to stay, but I could see their hearts were not in it. They wanted adventure, not the hard slog of ranching. I told them to go to chase their dreams. I just did not expect them to stay away so long. Do they write? Yates asked. Occasionally, Grace said. James, my eldest, sent a letter about 3 months ago. He is working in the gold fields near Sacramento. He says he is doing well, but I wonder. Thomas, my younger son, writes less often. His last letter came 6 months ago. He was in San Francisco working on the docks. She smiled sadly. They have their own lives now. I cannot expect them to worry about their mother. They should, Yates said firmly. Family is important. They rode back to Piotch in companionable silence. That evening, as they sat on Grace's porch watching the sunset, Yates took her hand. It was the first time he had held her hand since that initial dinner, and Grace felt the warmth of his touch spread through her entire body. I have to go back to the Morrison ranch tomorrow, he said quietly. I have been gone too long already. Grace felt a stab of disappointment. I understand. You have responsibilities, but I will come back, Yates continued. Morrison owes me 2 days off at the end of the month. I will come then if you will have me. Yes, Grace said without hesitation. I will have you. Yates lifted her hand and kissed it gently. You are starting to believe again, are you not? Grace smiled. Maybe. A little. Good, Yates said. That is a start. He left early the next morning, and Grace stood on her porch and watched him ride away. She felt his absence acutely, as if a light had been extinguished. She went about her work, helping with 2 births and treating various ailments around town, but everything felt muted without Yates there. The 2 weeks, until his return, seemed to drag. Grace found herself counting the days, which both annoyed and amused her. She was too old to be acting like a lovesick girl, she told herself. But the truth was, Yates had awakened something in her that she had thought was dead. She felt alive again, connected to the world in a way she had not been in years. When Yates finally returned, riding into Piatch on a bright May morning, Grace abandoned all pretense of dignity and ran to meet him. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, and for a moment they simply held each other. "I missed you," Grace said against his chest. "I missed you too," Yates replied. He pulled back to look at her face. "I did a lot of thinking while I was gone." "About what?" Grace asked. "About us, about the future." He took her hand. "Come walk with me, I have something to show you." Curious, Grace went with him. Yates led her to the edge of town, to a piece of land she had always admired. It was about 20 acres with good grass and access to water. A small creek ran through one corner, and there were enough trees to provide shade in the brutal summer heat. "What do you think of this land?" Yates asked. "It is lovely," Grace said. "Why?" Yates turned to face her. "Because I bought it. Yesterday, before I rode here, I put down every penny I have saved over the past 7 years. Grace stared at him. "You bought land in Piatch." "I did," Yates confirmed. "Because I am serious about you, Grace. I am serious about building a life here if you will be part of it." Grace felt her heart hammering. "Yates, that is a huge risk. What if I say no? What if this does not work out between us?" "Then I will still have good land and a new start," Yates said. "But I do not think you are going to say no." He took both her hands in his. "Grace Merrick, I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. I know this is fast, maybe too fast by any reasonable standard, but I also know that I love you. I love your strength and your honesty. I love the way you care for people, the way you keep going even when you are tired. I love talking with you, being with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me." Grace felt tears streaming down her face. "This is crazy." "Probably," Yates agreed. "But I mean every word. Marry me, Grace. Let me show you every day for the rest of our lives that hope is real, that love is real, that we deserve a second chance at happiness." Grace looked at him, at this man who had ridden into her life during a dust storm and turned everything upside down. Every logical part of her mind screamed that this was too fast, too risky, too much. But her heart, her battered, bruised heart that had learned to protect itself by feeling nothing, was singing. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Yates let out a shout of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, and then deeper as Grace responded. She had not been kissed in 5 years, and the sensation was overwhelming. She clung to Yates, feeling as if she might float away if she let go. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "When?" Yates asked. "When will you marry me?" "Soon," Grace said. "As soon as we can arrange it. I do not want to wait." "Neither do I," Yates said. He kissed her again, and Grace felt all the walls she had built around her heart crumbling. She was terrified and elated and more alive than she had felt in years. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Piatch. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Martha Wilson helped her sew, and Yates wore his best suit. Martha and her husband stood as witnesses, along with Tom Fletcher and his wife. It was a small gathering, intimate and perfect. Reverend Thompson, who had led the church for 15 years, smiled as he pronounced them man and wife. "You may kiss your bride," he said to Yates. Yates did, with a tenderness that made Grace's heart overflow. As they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, Grace caught sight of their reflection in one of the church windows. She looked radiant, she realized with surprise. Happy. Alive. They held a small reception at Grace's house, which would now be their home until they could build a new one on Yates's land. Friends and neighbors brought food and well wishes. Several people commented on how different Grace looked, how much younger and happier she seemed. "Love will do that," Martha said with satisfaction. "I told you that man was exactly what you needed." As the sun set and the guests departed, Yates and Grace were finally alone. Grace felt suddenly nervous, standing in her bedroom with her new husband. It had been so long since she had shared her bed with anyone. Yates seemed to sense her nervousness. "We do not have to rush anything," he said gently. "We have the rest of our lives." Grace looked at him, at this good, patient man who had waited for her to believe again. "I want this," she said. "I want you. I am just a little scared." "So am I," Yates admitted. "It has been a long time for me too, but we will figure it out together." He held out his hand and Grace took it. And as they came together, as Yates kissed her with growing passion and Grace responded with equal fervor, she felt the last of her fear melt away. This was right. This was real. This was hope made flesh. The next months were a blur of happiness and hard work. Yates began building their house on the new land, working from dawn until dusk. Grace continued her midwifery work, but now she had someone to come home to, someone to share her days with. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of Grace's small house and talk about their plans. "I want the house to be big enough for a family," Yates said one night. "Not just us, but room for your sons when they visit, and maybe, if we are blessed, for children of our own." Grace had not thought about having more children. At 42, she had assumed that part of her life was over. "I might be too old," she said carefully. "Maybe," Yates agreed. "But maybe not. Either way, I want the space. I want our home to be welcoming, full of life and love." Grace leaned against him, feeling safe and cherished. "I love you," she said. The words still felt new, strange on her tongue after so many years of silence. "I love you too," Yates replied, kissing the top of her head. In August, Grace received a letter from James, her eldest son. He was coming home, he wrote. He had made some money in the gold fields and wanted to see his mother, to meet the man she had married. Grace cried when she read the letter, and Yates held her as she wept with joy. James arrived in early September, riding into Piach on a fine horse and wearing new clothes. He had filled out, Grace saw, become more of a man in the 3 years since she had last seen him. He was 24 now, with his father's dark hair and serious eyes. At first, the reunion was awkward. James clearly had not known what to expect, and he eyed Yates with suspicion. But Yates won him over with patience and respect, talking to James about the land, the plans for the house, the life they were building. "You make my mother happy," James said to Yates one evening when Grace had gone inside to prepare dinner. "I can see that. I try to," Yates replied. "She deserves happiness," James nodded slowly. "I am sorry I left her alone for so long. After Pa died, I just wanted to get away from everything that reminded me of him. I did not think about how hard it would be for her." "She understood," Yates said. "She loves you. She wants you to be happy." "I know," James said. "And I am glad she has you now. She should not be alone." James stayed for 2 weeks before heading back to California, but before he left, he promised to write more often, to visit more regularly. Grace hugged him tightly, breathing in the scent of her son, thanking God for bringing him back to her, even if only for a little while. In October, the house was finally finished. It was a beautiful structure, solid and well built, with a large kitchen, a spacious bedroom, and 2 smaller rooms for guests or future children. Yates had even built Grace a special room where she could store her midwifery supplies and meet with expectant mothers. They moved in on a crisp autumn day, carrying their few possessions from Grace's old house in town. As Grace stood in her new kitchen, looking out the window at the land stretching before her, she felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. "You like it?" Yates asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I love it," Grace said. "It is perfect." "You are perfect," Yates murmured, kissing her neck. Grace turned in his arms. "I am not perfect. I am scarred and older and set in my ways." "You are perfect for me," Yates corrected. "And that is all that matters." That winter was hard, as Nevada winters always were. The wind howled down from the mountains, and snow covered the ground for weeks at a time. But Grace and Yates were snug in their new house, with a good stove and plenty of wood. They spent the long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together. In February, Grace realized that her monthly courses had stopped. At first, she thought it was simply her age, the natural ending of her childbearing years. But when the nausea started and the fatigue, she began to wonder. She said nothing to Yates, afraid to hope, afraid to be wrong. But as the weeks passed and her symptoms continued, she finally allowed herself to believe. She was pregnant. At 43 years old, she was going to have another child. She told Yates on a Sunday morning in late March. They were sitting at their kitchen table, eating breakfast, when she suddenly set down her fork. "I have something to tell you." Yates looked up, concern in his eyes. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," Grace said. She took his hand. "Yates, I am with child. I am pregnant." The look on Yates's face went through a dozen emotions in the space of seconds: shock, joy, fear, wonder. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Grace said. "I have delivered enough babies to know the signs. I am about 3 months along, I think." Yates stood abruptly, then sat back down, then stood again. "A baby? We are going to have a baby." Grace laughed at his reaction. "Yes, we are. Are you happy?" "Happy." Yates came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "Grace, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I could burst." He held her at arm's length. "But you will be careful, won't you? No more riding out alone to help with births, no heavy lifting. I cannot lose you." Grace heard the fear in his voice and understood it. He had lost a wife in childbirth before. "I will be careful," she promised. "But you have to trust that I know what I am doing. I have helped hundreds of women through pregnancy. I know how to take care of myself." "I know you do," Yates said. "But let me worry anyway. It is a husband's job." The months of Grace's pregnancy passed in a mix of joy and anxiety. Yates was attentive to the point of being overbearing, constantly asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if she was eating enough. Grace bore his concern with patience, understanding the fear that drove it. In May, Thomas, Grace's younger son, arrived unexpectedly. He had received a letter from James about the baby, and he had come to see his mother. Like James, Thomas had matured in his time away. He was 22 now, strong and tanned from his work on the San Francisco docks. The reunion was emotional. Grace wept to see her youngest son again, and Thomas seemed genuinely remorseful for staying away so long. He and Yates hit it off immediately, bonding over shared hard work and straightforward talk. "You will make a good father," Thomas told Yates one evening. "This baby is lucky to have you." "I hope so," Yates said quietly. "I hope I can be what this child needs." Thomas stayed through the summer, helping Yates with work on the ranch and keeping Grace company as her pregnancy advanced. She was grateful for his presence, for the chance to reconnect with her son before the baby came. Grace went into labor on a hot afternoon in early August. She had been hanging laundry when the first contraction hit, a familiar tightening that told her the baby was coming. She called for Yates, who came running from the barn, his face pale with worry. "It is time," Grace said calmly. "Send Thomas to fetch Martha Wilson. She has helped me with births before. She will know what to do." "I am not leaving you," Yates said. "You have to," Grace said firmly. "Thomas does not know where Martha lives. You do. Go quickly." Yates went, though clearly reluctant. Thomas helped Grace inside and settled her in the bedroom. Grace talked him through what was happening, her own calm helping to ease his nervousness. Yates returned with Martha within 20 minutes. The older woman took charge immediately, shooing the men out of the room. "This is women's work," she said firmly. "You two wait outside." Grace labored through the afternoon and into the evening. It was harder than she remembered, her body older and less resilient than it had been during her previous pregnancies. But she had Martha's capable help, and the knowledge that Yates was just outside the door, waiting and praying. Finally, as the sun was setting, Grace gave a final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's cry. Martha worked quickly and then placed a small, squirming bundle in Grace's arms. "You have a son," Martha said, smiling. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Grace looked down at her son, at his tiny face and dark hair, and felt her heart expand. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Martha cleaned up the room and then opened the door. "You can come in now," she said to Yates and Thomas. They came in together, and Grace saw tears streaming down Yates's face as he approached the bed. "Is he all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you all right?" "We are both fine," Grace assured him. "Come meet your son." Yates sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby with wonder. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Thomas came to look as well, grinning. "I have a baby brother. This is strange." Grace laughed. "Strange but wonderful." They named the baby Robert Yates Quinn, after Grace's first husband and his new father. Little Robert was a good baby, healthy and strong, with a powerful set of lungs and a fierce grip. Yates was a devoted father, getting up in the night to bring the baby to Grace for feeding, changing diapers with surprising skill, and spending hours simply holding his son and marveling at him. Thomas stayed for another month before returning to California, promising to visit more often now that he had a baby brother to spoil. Grace was sad to see him go, but grateful for the time they had together. As the seasons turned and Robert grew from a newborn to a chubby, smiling infant, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been alone and hopeless, convinced her life was over. Now she had a husband she loved deeply, a beautiful son, and reconnections with her older boys. She had been given a second chance at happiness, and she treasured every moment. One evening in late autumn, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset while Robert slept inside, Yates took Grace's hand. "Do you remember what you said to me the day we met?" "I said a lot of things that day," Grace replied with a smile. "You said you were too old for hope," Yates reminded her, "and I said I would wait until you believed again." Grace squeezed his hand. "I believe now," she said softly. "You taught me to hope again, to love again, to live again. You saved me, Yates, not just from that dust storm, but from myself." "No," Yates said, bringing her hand to his lips. "We saved each other. I was as lost as you were before we met. You gave me a reason to settle down, to build a life, to hope for a future. We found each other exactly when we needed to." "Do you think it was fate?" Grace asked. "That dust storm bringing us together? I think it was grace," Yates said, smiling at the double meaning. "In every sense of the word." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Inside the house, Robert began to fuss, and Grace stood to tend to him. Yates followed her inside, and together they cared for their son, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of a long-time partnership. The years that followed were not without challenges. Ranching was hard work, and there were droughts and difficult seasons. But Yates and Grace faced everything together, their love growing deeper with each passing year. When Robert was 2 years old, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she delivered a healthy baby girl in the spring. They named her Clara Rose, after Yates's first wife and Grace's favorite flower. Yates wept when he held his daughter for the first time, grateful beyond words for the second chance he had been given. James visited frequently and eventually moved back to Piotch permanently, buying his own small ranch nearby. He married a young woman from town and started his own family. Thomas continued working in California but came home for several weeks each year, becoming a beloved uncle to Robert and Clara. As Grace moved through her 40s and into her 50s, she gradually reduced her midwifery work, training a younger woman to take over most of the responsibilities. She focused instead on her family, on raising Robert and Clara, and on supporting Yates as he built their ranch into a successful operation. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Grace by taking her back to the rocky outcropping where they had sheltered during the dust storm. He had found the spot again through careful searching and had marked it with a small cairn of stones. "This is where it all started," he said, holding her close as they stood at the entrance. "This is where I saw you and knew my life was about to change." Grace looked around at the familiar rock formations, remembering how terrified she had been that day, how certain she was that her life was essentially over. "I thought I was going to die that day," she said. "Instead, I started living again." "We both did," Yates said. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I love you, Grace Quinn. I have loved you from the moment I pulled your horse through that storm, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Grace replied, tears in her eyes. "You waited for me to believe again. You were patient and kind and stubborn. You did not give up on me even when I had given up on myself." "I could never give up on you," Yates said. He kissed her, deep and tender, and Grace felt the same spark she had felt on their wedding night, the same connection that had only grown stronger with time. They rode back to their ranch as the sun was setting, racing each other like young people, laughing and free. When they arrived home, Robert and Clara ran out to greet them, and Grace swept her children into her arms, breathing in their sweet scent. This was her life now. This was the future she had never dared to hope for. A loving husband, healthy children, a beautiful home. It was more than she deserved, more than she had ever expected, and she was grateful for every precious moment. As the years continued to pass, Grace watched her children grow. Robert became a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with his father on the ranch. Clara was spirited and adventurous, always exploring and asking questions. Grace taught her daughter about plants and healing, passing on the knowledge she had accumulated over decades of midwifery. When Robert was 12 and Clara was 10, Grace and Yates sat them down and told them the story of how they had met. The children listened with rapt attention as their parents described the dust storm, the shelter, and Yates's promise to wait until Grace believed in hope again. "That is the most romantic story ever," Clara breathed when they finished. "It is pretty good," Robert agreed, trying to sound more sophisticated than his years. "The important thing," Yates said, pulling Grace close, "is that we never gave up. Not on each other and not on the idea that life could be better. Even when things seemed impossible, we kept trying. And that is what we want for you," Grace added. "To never stop hoping, never stop believing that good things can happen. Life will be hard sometimes, but it will also be beautiful. Do not give up." The children nodded solemnly, taking in their parents' words. Grace continued to age gracefully, her hair going fully white but her eyes remaining bright and alert. Yates stayed strong and active, though his own hair grayed and his face gained more lines. They grew old together, side by side, facing each challenge and celebrating each joy as a team. When Grace turned 60, the family threw a large celebration. James came with his wife and 3 children. Thomas arrived from California, where he had finally settled down with a wife of his own. The house was full of laughter and love, and Grace looked around at all the people who meant so much to her and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Grace and Yates sat alone on their porch, just as they had so many times before. The Nevada sky was clear and full of stars, and the air was cool and pleasant. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "For what?" Yates asked, though his smile suggested he knew. "For everything," Grace said. "For finding me in that storm, for not giving up on me. For loving me when I did not think I deserved to be loved, for giving me this beautiful life." Yates took her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. "I should be thanking you. You gave me a reason to stop drifting. You gave me a home and a family. You gave me purpose." "We gave each other those things," Grace corrected. "That is what love does. It builds and grows and becomes something bigger than just two people." "You are wiser in your old age," Yates teased gently. Grace laughed. "I am old, that much is true, but I am not bitter about it anymore. Age is a gift, not a curse. Every year I have had with you has been precious." "We are not done yet," Yates said. "We have many more years ahead of us." And they did. Grace and Yates lived into their 70s, watching their children marry and have children of their own. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Grace finally retired from midwifery entirely at age 65, passing her knowledge on to the next generation. Robert took over managing the ranch when Yates's health began to decline, proving himself to be a capable and thoughtful steward. Clara became a teacher in Piach, educating the children of the town with patience and creativity. Both children stayed close to home, wanting to be near their parents. On a warm spring evening, when Grace was 75 and Yates was 67, they sat together on their porch one last time. Yates had been ill for several months, his heart growing weaker. Grace knew with the certainty of her medical training that his time was limited. "I am not afraid," Yates told her, holding her hand as the sun set. "I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. That is more than most people ever get." "Do not talk like that," Grace said, though tears streamed down her face. "You cannot leave me." "I do not want to," Yates said gently. "But we do not always get to choose." He squeezed her hand. "Grace, you gave me 30 years of happiness. 30 years I never expected to have after Clara and Lily died. You were my second chance, my redemption. I will never regret a single moment we spent together." "Neither will I," Grace whispered. "I love you so much, Yates. You saved my life in every way that matters." "And you saved mine," Yates replied. "Remember that. Remember that we found each other when we were both lost, and we built something beautiful. Remember that hope is always worth believing in." Yates passed away peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by his family. Grace held his hand until the very end, and when he took his last breath, she felt as if part of her own soul had departed with him. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that made breathing difficult. But as the days and weeks passed, Grace found comfort in her memories. She thought about that dust storm so many years ago, about the terrified woman who had been certain her life was over. She thought about Yates's promise to wait until she believed in hope again, and how he had kept that promise every single day of their marriage. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love and support. They shared stories about Yates, keeping his memory alive. And slowly, Grace began to heal. The sharp edge of grief softened into a bittersweet ache, bearable because it was proof of how deeply she had loved. Grace lived for another 5 years after Yates's death. She spent those years with her family, playing with her grandchildren, tending her garden, and writing down the story of her life with Yates. She wanted future generations to know about the cowboy who had saved her during a dust storm, and had then saved her again by teaching her to hope. On a clear autumn day, when the Nevada sky was impossibly blue and the air had the first crisp bite of winter approaching, Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 80 years old, and she died in the house that Yates had built for her, surrounded by the evidence of the beautiful life they had created together. Robert and Clara buried their mother next to their father on a hill overlooking the ranch. The view stretched for miles, encompassing the land that Yates had bought all those years ago, the house he had built, and the legacy they had created together. At the funeral, Robert stood before the gathered crowd and told the story of how his parents had met. He spoke of the dust storm, of his mother's despair, and of his father's simple but profound promise. He talked about the love that had sustained them through decades of marriage, through hardships and joys, through the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life. "My father used to say that my mother saved him," Robert concluded, his voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is they saved each other. They found each other in the middle of a storm and decided to build something beautiful. They taught us that it is never too late for hope, never too late for love. And that is the legacy they left us. Not just this ranch or this family, but the knowledge that second chances exist for those brave enough to take them." As the mourners dispersed, Clara placed a bouquet of wildflowers on her parents' graves. They were the same kind of flowers that Yates had brought Grace on their first official courting visit, hardy desert blooms that survived in harsh conditions. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. In the distance, a dust devil spun across the land, harmless and almost playful. Clara watched it and smiled through her tears, thinking about how a dust storm had brought her parents together and had ultimately given her and Robert life. Years later, when Robert's grandchildren asked about their great-grandparents, he would take them to the cairn of stones that marked the shelter where Grace and Yates had first met. He would tell them the story of a widowed midwife who thought she was too old for hope, and a lonely cowboy who promised to wait until she believed again. And the children would listen, wide-eyed and fascinated, learning that love could come at any age, that second chances were real, and that hope was always worth believing in. They would learn that even in the harshest environments, beauty could bloom, that even in the darkest storms, light could be found. The ranch continued to prosper, passed down through generations of the Quinn family. The house that Yates built stood strong, a testament to his craftsmanship and love. And the story of Grace and Yates became family legend, told and retold until it was impossible to separate fact from mythology. But the essential truth remained unchanged. Two broken people had found each other in the middle of a storm and had chosen to build a life together. They had taken their pain and loneliness and transformed them into love and family. They had proved that it was never too late to start over, never too late to believe in hope. In the end, that was their greatest legacy. Not the land or the house, or even the children and grandchildren who carried on their name. It was the simple but profound truth that love could heal, that hope could sustain, and that second chances existed for those brave enough to reach for them. Grace had been right when she told Yates that she was too old for hope, but Yates had been equally right when he promised to wait until she believed again, because hope was not something you aged out of. It was not something that could be lost forever. It was a light that could be rekindled, a seed that could bloom even in desert soil, a promise that could be kept through patience and love. And in the wild, unforgiving landscape of Nevada in the late 1800s, Grace Merrick and Yates Quinn had proved that truth beyond any doubt. They had taken their broken pieces and created something whole. They had faced the storms of life together and had emerged stronger for it. They had built a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. As the years passed and the 20th century dawned, bringing with it changes that would transform the American West forever, the story of Grace and Yates remained constant. It was told at family gatherings and written in journals. It was passed down from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren, a reminder that some truths were eternal. Love could conquer loneliness. Hope could overcome despair. And two people, meeting by chance in the middle of a dust storm, could create a lifetime of happiness together if they were willing to try. That was the story of Grace Merrick and Yates Quinn, a story of second chances and renewed hope. A story of love finding a way even in the harshest circumstances. A story that proved, beyond any doubt, that it was never too late to believe again.